Genesis 22, verses 1 to 14, New English translation. Sometime after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," Abraham replied. God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will indicate to you." Early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young servants with him, along with his son Isaac. When he had cut the wood for the burnt offering, he started out for the place God had spoken to him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham caught sight of the place in the distance. So he said to his servants, "You 2 stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go up there. We will worship and then return to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. Then he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." "What is it, my son?" he replied. "Here is the fire and the wood," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering," he said. The 2 of them continued on together. When they came to the place God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife, and prepared to slaughter his son. But the Lord's angel called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not harm the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw behind him a ram caught in the bushes by its horns. So he went over and got the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord Provides." It is said to this day, "In the mountain of the Lord provision will be made." The book of Genesis tells many stories about the history of this planet. It tells the story of creation itself. It tells the story of the original rebellion of our ancestors in the Garden of Eden and their subsequent banishment from that paradise. It tells the story of how the ancient world became so corrupt and sinful that God reluctantly decided to destroy it in a flood. And it tells the story of great people, too, people larger than life who shape the reality of our existence today. 2 of those people are featured in today's text: Abraham, the father of the faithful, and Isaac, the promised son. Isaac was still a young man when the events of today's text happened. His father was not young. Abraham was 115 years old by now. I want us to look carefully at the characters that predominate in the drama our text reports. We don't know the whole story unless we're willing to investigate what happened from the perspective of all those involved. That is one of the reasons that the Bible often tells the same story more than once. The stories of Israel's kings are scattered throughout 6 books, 6 books that we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the New Testament, we have the life of Christ told us by 4 different authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each tells the story of Christ's earthly life from their perspective, highlighting the things that made the most impact on them. They do not contradict each other, but neither do they see it necessary to parrot the others. We don't have different variations of the story in today's text, but we do realize that things are happening that affect each central character differently. I want us to look at these events from the perspective first of Isaac, then of Abraham, and then of God himself, and the message he has for us. The story from Isaac's perspective. The meaning of Isaac's name, Yitzchak in Hebrew, is laughter. He got his name by means of an incident in his parents' life before he was born. The Lord told Abraham that he was going to bless Sarah by giving her a son. She had always wanted a child, but she had been barren, and she was 90 years old when God made this promise. She had already given up on the hope of ever giving birth to a son of her own. Both Abraham and Sarah immediately laughed when they heard that promise. That's how Isaac got his name. Sarah had long passed menopause, so she agreed to a plan to have a son by means of a surrogate mother, her handmaid Hagar. They named this son Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. The couple believed that their son Ishmael was how God had heard and answered their prayer. We are often convinced that when we come up with a plan and it seems to work, it must be God's will. But Ishmael was not God's plan. God's plan was the miracle child, Isaac. Isaac lived a privileged life. If he wasn't a spoiled brat, then he had every reason to be. Isaac was heir to the covenant God had made with his father. In today's story, he goes along with his father on a trip to the mountains. Isaac didn't know all the details, but he knew his father wanted him along, and that was okay because he loved his father. When they got to Mount Moriah, Abraham dismissed his servants and just he and Isaac climbed the mountain. He had told the servants that he and Isaac were going up onto the mountain to worship and that they would return when they were finished. But when they got to the summit, Isaac noticed that something was missing. He had lugged a pile of wood on his back all the way up the mountain, but he saw no lamb for the sacrifice. That itself was not a significant problem. Isaac probably figured that Abraham had already arranged for a lamb to be brought to the summit. Maybe Isaac thought that the father was forgetting things in his old age, so on the way up, he asked Abraham where the lamb was. Abraham just said that God will provide for himself. The verb Abraham used for provide is related to the noun Moriah. So Isaac figured his father knew, so that settled it. Until they actually got to the summit. An altar was built, but there was no sacrificial lamb in sight. Isaac was probably in shock when his father placed him on the altar and strapped him down with some ropes. This passage does not tell us that Isaac said anything. I cannot imagine him remaining silent, but perhaps he did. If Isaac did stay quiet during this ordeal, it could only be a sign for us of another promised son who would remain silent while he was being sacrificed. But Isaac's story has a happy ending because God intervenes and prevents his death. A substitute is found, and Abraham's statement is proven true. God did provide. Let's look at this story from Abraham's perspective. Moriah is not Abraham's first rodeo. He and God have a history. He has been tested time and time again. Sometimes he passes the test. Sometimes he tries to do things his way and winds up complicating things. But all the time, Abraham has been learning how to live by faith in God. Abraham had come to a point in his life when living by faith has paid off with the fruit of faith. He had become wealthy and respected. At long last, he was given the blessing of Isaac, who would succeed him as patriarch of his clan and would inherit special blessings of the covenant. So Abraham was not expecting another test at this point in his life. But the test came that day that God gave him a command. God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will indicate to you." God said, "Go," and Abraham went. But you can bet his mind was going 1,000 different directions as he traveled. He went over the promises that God had given him. Many of those promises are specifically related to Isaac and his future. But Abraham wondered how God's promises about Isaac could be fulfilled if Isaac died. Could the covenant be passed on through Ishmael instead? No, that can't be it. God had explicitly named Isaac as the one who would pass on the blessing. Abraham continued to think. A long walk is an excellent opportunity to consider, and the walk to Moriah takes 3 days. At some point, Abraham hit upon the idea that God must plan to raise Isaac from the dead in order to fulfill his promises about him. The book of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He had received the promises, yet he was ready to offer up his only son. God had told him, through Isaac, your descendants will carry on your name. And he reasoned that God could even raise him from the dead. Hebrews 11:17-19. So Abraham thought that must be how God was going to do this. It took a lot of faith for Abraham to come to that conclusion. After all, we have the benefit of knowing all about the miracle of resurrection. We know about Elijah raising the widow's son in Sidon, 1 Kings 17. We know about Elisha doing the same thing in Shunem, 2 Kings 4. We know about how Jesus raised Lazarus, John 11, and the widow's son at Nain, Luke 7, and Jairus' daughter, Matthew 9. We read about many other resurrections in the New Testament, but Abraham did not have a single story to point to. He reasoned that God, who gave us life, can give it back again after we are dead. He reasoned that the God who promises things to his people can make a way to fulfill those promises. And even death is not an obstacle to his doing that. So here's this old saint of God, raising his knife. He's getting ready to put an end to the nearest and dearest thing in the world to him. But he trusts God. He does not know why God is demanding that he do such a thing. It does not fit in his theology. It goes against everything he has ever learned about God in his 115 years of getting to know him. But if God says that his son must die on this mountain, then he's going to do it. In the last second before Abraham's knife finds itself going down in the direction of his beloved, he hears an angel's voice. God has provided, and he has found a way to do it without Isaac's death. From now on, when people ask about Moriah, he will tell them this story. It's the story of how God provided a substitute for the life of his son on the mountain called Moriah, a mountain with a name that means the place where he provides. The story from God's perspective. But the story is not over because there's another main character in these events whom we have not investigated. God himself has a reason for the things that took place on that mountain on that day. In fact, he has several reasons. He was teaching his friend that staying faithful to him will sometimes mean doing things that cannot be explained. The mission will not always be easy. The plan of God for our lives will often lead us to bitter conflict within ourselves as we wrestle with paradoxes and puzzles. But God calls us to be faithful anyway. He loves us, and he wants us to trust in that love, even when we feel very much unloved. He wants us to know that he is our friend, even when all the evidence suggests that he's an enemy. Something else was going on through the mind of God on that day. It was something that even Abraham did not know and would not know. The events at Moriah were a divine dress rehearsal for other events that would take place 19 centuries later. It was here, on this same mountain range, in a city called Jerusalem, that another promised son would be sacrificed. Only when this event happens will there be no last-minute deliverance by the angel's voice. The angel will remain silent when the world's only innocent man dies on the cross. God knew what Abraham did not know. He knew that this would be how the human race found redemption from the slavery of sin. He knew that to demonstrate his passionate love for us, God would have to sacrifice his only son, whom he loves, to a lonely and violent death on this same mountain. So for us today, Abraham's ordeal means even more than the story of an old man's willingness to do something unthinkable because he trusts God. It is the Old Testament prediction of our loving God's supreme sacrifice so that he could call back all believers to life again. He had no reason to do that except for his elaborate and compassionate love for his lost children. If you ever start to feel that God must not love you because things are not working out the way you want, think of Moriah. If you ever feel that God is unfair to test you, think of Moriah. If you ever question your value in God's sight, think of Golgotha. He loves you so much and has invested so much in you that the least you could do is in return is to spend your life serving him and eternity worshiping him.